I'm David Knowles, and this is Ukraine, the latest. Today, we bring you the latest news from across Ukraine, discuss the arrest of Telegram messaging app CEO Pavel Durov, and we speak to friend of the podcast Adam Kinzinger about his turn at the Democratic National Congress and his views on the war and democracy in the United States.
Bravery takes you through the most unimaginable hardships to finally reward you with victory.
The first duty of my government is security and defence, to make clear our unshakable support of NATO and with our allies towards Ukraine.
Kyiv stands strong.
Nobody's going to break us. We're strong. We're Ukrainians.
It's Thursday, the 29th of August, 2 years and 192 days since the full-scale invasion began. And today I'm joined by our associate editor Dominic Nicholls, senior technology reporter Matt Field, and our guest is former United States representative and now political commentator Adam Kinzinger. I started by asking Dom for the latest news from Ukraine and Russia.
Well, hi David. Hello team. Let's start inside Ukraine. Russia launched a series of missile and drone strikes against Kyiv overnight last night, the third such attack in a week. Several explosions were heard over the capital, air alerts active in most of central and northern Ukraine actually overnight. Ukrainian forces say they destroyed 60 out of 74 drones and 2 out of 3 Kh-59 or 69 variant guided aerial missiles. The 14 other drones, they say, fell or were lost on Ukrainian territory. That comes from the Air Force. They said in a statement, this is Ukraine's Air Force, aviation, anti-aircraft missile troops, electronic warfare and mobile fire groups of the Ukrainian Air Force and Defence Forces were involved in repelling the air attack. Now, around 15 of these drones were reportedly brought down over the capital city, Kyiv. Falling debris damaged multiple buildings across the city, but no casualties reported. As a side note to this, these air attacks this week are said to have cost Moscow about 1.3 billion, big B billion US dollars. This comes from Britain's representative to the UN. James Kariuki, he made the claims at a UN Security Council meeting yesterday where he said this week's air attacks represent continued evidence, in his words, that Moscow is intentionally targeting civilian infrastructure. Now, you may remember 7 people were killed on Monday when Moscow launched one of the largest air attacks of the war so far. That was followed up by attacks across Ukraine on Tuesday, so overnight, Monday, Tuesday. That killed a further 5. I still think it's just incredible how low the figure is, given the scale of the strikes. As I said yesterday, these are all represent lives ruined. Now, Mr. Kariuki said, the consequence of Putin's miscalculation for the Russian people is increasingly evident. And that figure, $1.3 billion, that comes from a report by Forbes Ukraine and Ekonomiczna Pravda. Now, staying in Ukraine, and Russia has continued its grinding assault towards Pokrovsk. Russian forces have seized the settlement of Komishivka, that's in Ukraine's eastern Donetsk region, about 12k southeast of Pokrovsk. This comes from the TASS news agency, state-affiliated Russian news agency. They're citing Russia's defense ministry, so we can't verify any of that, but that does seem to tally with what else we've seen elsewhere, including geolocated footage from Tuesday that shows Ukrainian forces that have recently regained lost positions southwest of Ivano-Dorivka, about 20 k's northeast of Bakhmut, but other geolocated footage generally shows that continued Russian advancement across the Donbas and the east of the country, not so much in the north and south, little bits, but mainly the east. And Pokrovsk, as we've said recently, that is the focus. That's where Russia is really pushing hard. The last 24 hours, 5 civilians killed, at least 43 injured over that period. This comes from Ukraine's regional authorities. Now let's go into Russia. And several Russian mill bloggers, which is regarding Kursk, one of the only real outlets of information. But several Russian mill bloggers are saying the tempo of Ukrainian attacks in Kursk Oblast has slowed and that Ukrainian forces are now digging in. Now, I've seen evidence elsewhere on social media, images of Ukraine's supposed trenches and other fortifications starting to be built. I really hope that they are doing it properly and in a timely manner. And if that sounds patronising, I'm sorry, I don't care, because that's not been the experience of Ukrainian forces elsewhere on the front lines If that sounds brutal, it is born of love and frustration. Anyway, ISW, the Institute for the Study of War, are reporting other Russian mill bloggers saying that Moscow's forces are gradually stabilising the situation in Kursk Oblast. Now, these two reports may be looking at the same thing. Obviously, if you, Ukraine, don't intend to go any further forward but plan to dig in and hold what you've got, that could be interpreted by the other side or as the other side being successful in stopping any advance. So, as ever, there's the fog of war here. We are doing the best we can with the limited information we've got. But it would seem sensible, or it would seem likely that certainly in the around Suja and Koronovo areas of Kursk, it looks like Ukraine might be transitioning into a static sort of defensive position there. Now, geolocated footage published yesterday shows Russian forces operating in eastern Koronovo. That might suggest Ukrainian forces have recently withdrawn from that area. And there's other reporting that says Russian forces have regained some recently lost positions, but also a lot of other talk of continued Ukrainian advancement in Kursk, albeit very small gains. Now, the CIA helpfully have come out with an assessment of Ukrainian Kursk aims. Yesterday, the deputy director of the agency said Ukrainian troops are intent on retaining the Russian territory they have seized, quote, for some period of time. So speaking at the Intelligence and National Security Summit in Washington, David Cohen said the significance of the Kursk invasion remains to be seen, but he added, quote, they are remaining in Russia. They are building defences and seem to be intent on retaining some of the territory for some amount of time, unquote. Now, there's a lot of sums in there, broadly in line with what we're thinking. Well done, CIA. Anyway, Mr. Cohen said he believed Putin would mount a counteroffensive, but said it would be, or he expected it to be, a difficult fight for the Russians. I still think it's notable. I still think it's very notable that Russia has not done anything significant in Kursk. They are very clearly prioritising Pokrovsk. Well, I guess they're thinking that the political heat, they are able to take it. Still inside Russia, and Kyiv confirmed today that its forces had successfully attacked two oil storage facilities in Russia. We've talked about them in the last few days, but it's not often you get Ukrainian confirmation. This is the large blaze at the Atlas oil depot in southern Rostov region. That fire is thought to have spread to at least 4 other fuel tanks, and efforts to contain it so far have been unsuccessful. That's been burning for over 24 hours now. So Ukraine's military said it had successfully attacked the Zenit oil facility, also in Russia's Kirov region. That's the one we talked yesterday about 1,500 kilometres northeast from the closest point of Ukraine. They say a field artillery depot in the Russian region of Voronezh was also attacked. And then in the last couple of hours, the Kyiv Post, quoting Interfax, say that the Russian government has abruptly announced that oil and fuel production numbers will now be a state secret. They're not going to tell us the numbers anymore. I think someone is getting rattled in Moscow. Vyacheslav Gladkov, still in Russia now, Vyacheslav Gladkov, who's the regional governor of Russia's Belgorod Oblast, that borders Ukraine just north of Kharkiv, about 150 k's-ish southeast of the Kursk incursion. He said that Ukrainian shelling yesterday had killed one person and injured several more. He said the town of Shebekino, that's directly across the border, 10 k's north of Vovchansk, came under attack by Ukrainian forces. Possibly linked to that story, the Kyiv Independent is reporting in the last hour that Russian troops being transported into Vovchansk, so from north to south going into Vovchansk, either as a rotation or to reinforce, because they've been bogged down there for weeks now, haven't they? But Russian troops being moved into Vovchansk were forced to retreat after being attacked and suffering some losses. They quote a post on Telegram from the Kharkiv group of forces that says Russian soldiers were travelling in 2 tanks and 2 other armoured vehicles, quote, as part of preparations for assault operations. It didn't specify how many Russian troops were killed in that engagement. Now then, news from the Kremlin. The Moscow Times is reporting that Russia's former Deputy Defence Minister Pavel Popov has been detained in Russia for fraud, on fraud charges. An army general, dismissed from his post 2 months ago, worked as Deputy Defence Minister for 11 years, long-time ally of Sergei Shoigu, the former Defence Minister, who sort of fell out of favour. We've been talking about this in the last few weeks, since Shoigu's sort of defenestration, if you like. There's thought to be a bit of a purge, small p purge, not the Stalinist purges yet, but the small p purge of the MOD by the FSB. There's big power plays going on in Moscow, and perhaps Pavel Popov is the latest casualty there. Now, elsewhere, the Kremlin really doesn't think much of Kyiv's proposed peace plan. Moscow's rejected President Zelensky's suggestion that we reported yesterday that Kyiv will submit a plan to Washington on how to end the war. This is going to be presented to the Biden administration and the two potential successors, Kamala Harris and Donald Trump. Now, as we reported yesterday, President Zelensky had said on Tuesday that the invasion would end with dialogue, but he accepted that Kyiv needed to be in a strong position for this. Sensible, but ahead of any dialogue. He said, this is President Zelensky saying, that the 3-week-long incursion now into Kursk was part of that plan. There would also be further steps on the economic and diplomatic fronts. Now, responding, the Kremlin today said Moscow had vowed to continue its special military operation in Ukraine. Dmitry Peskov, Kremlin spokesman, said, this is rather sniffily, this is not the first time that we've heard such statements from representatives of the Kyiv regime. We are aware of the nature of this Kyiv regime. We are continuing with our special military operation and will achieve all of our goals. I mean, Foreign Minister Lavrov has said that for as long as Kursk is going on, there's no chance of continuing thoughts about peace talks, because obviously before Kursk he was spending every waking moment working on a peace plan. Well, morphing into Washington, and Ukraine's going to present the Biden administration with a list of targets. It says it wants to strike inside Russia in the latest bid to push the US to lift restrictions on the use of American weapons gifted to Ukraine for use against Russia. Two senior Ukrainian officials, the head of the president's office and defense minister, are going to travel to Washington tomorrow to provide a list of priority targets, we are told, without which it will be difficult to change the course of the war in Ukraine's favour. That's a quote from a Ukrainian MP speaking to CNN. Now, related to that, Dmytro Kuleba, who's Ukraine's foreign minister, has urged Britain not to squander the momentum created by the invasion of Kursk and to grant permission for Storm Shadow strikes inside Russia. Mr. Kuleba said, what really matters is the timing, and this is the issue today. He was speaking as he arrived at a meeting of EU foreign ministers at the European Council in Brussels. He said, this is why we have a very open conversation with the UK, the US, asking them not to waste the momentum of our soldiers. He said Western missiles could be used to strike Russian airfields used in attacks on Ukrainian cities, and insisted the weapons would only be used to strike legitimate targets. Now, America's National Security Advisor, Jake Sullivan, he met with Chinese President Xi Jinping today. This is an announcement from the White House. Apparently, he and President Eleven discussed cross-strait issues, Russia's war against Ukraine and the South China Sea, the White House statement added. Interesting. Trying to leverage Chinese, if not support, then to end the continued support of Russia for the war. And then just an odd one to finish here, David. The Belarusian Air Force has apparently shot down a Russian Shahed drone that entered its airspace last night. This comes from the Belarusian Hajun project. It's an open source intelligence outlet that monitors military activity of Russian and Belarusian troops in Belarus. They said that the Iranian-made drone had entered Belarus's airspace in the Homel region of southeast Belarus. That's the bit bordering kind of northern Ukraine and a little bit of southwest Russia. Entered the airspace about 3:30 a.m. this morning, prompting the deployment of a Belarusian Air Force fighter jet. Then they say that less than half an hour later, there were 2 explosions heard in the Yelsk district and a bright flash was seen in the sky. Now, that district is right on the border with Ukraine, about 150 k's northwest of Kyiv. So in a statement, the Hadron Project said, this is probably the first recorded case of a Belarusian Air Force fighter attempting to destroy a real military target in the sky. In recent months, there have been numerous claims, you'll remember, of Shaheeds either flying over Belarus or heading into Belarus, having gone into Ukraine, and then, I don't know, something's gone wrong and it sort of circles around and heads north again. A spokesperson for the Hadron Project, speaking to Newsweek, said that there were no further details on the drone as yet, but that Minsk has been sending aircraft to control the drones flying into Belarus for a while. So deploying aircraft is not something unusual for the Belarusian Air Force in recent months, but today was the first time to actually shoot it down. Not sure how well that's going to go down in the Kremlin, and I wouldn't be surprised if Lukashenko feels the need to come out with some sort of fire-breathing threat against Ukraine to make up for it. We shall see, David. That's us up to date.
Well, thank you very much, Dom. Let's go now to our senior technology reporter, Matthew Field. Matt, thank you so much for joining us. I know it's a busy day on the desk, so thanks so much for your time. Can we talk about Pavel Durov, the Telegram chief executive, who's been charged by French authorities who allege he permitted his online messaging app, that's of course Telegram, to be used for a range of illegal activities. French officials allege the 39-year-old was complicit in a number of illegal transactions. This story is hugely important for our podcast and for the war in Ukraine. So, Matt, tell us, what should we know about Pavel Durov? Who is he? And for those of us who need an introduction, what exactly is Telegram and why is it important in this war?
Thanks for that, David. So, Pavel Durov is 39, Russian-born internet entrepreneur. He is the founder of Telegram, which, for those of you who don't know, I suspect most people who follow the war in Ukraine closely will know a great deal about Telegram, but it's a messaging app, sometimes called an encrypted messaging app. It is used for messaging and sharing. It's kind of like a cross between WhatsApp and Twitter. Durov was based in Dubai and is effectively somewhat of a Russian in exile. He was the founder of a prominent Russian social network, VK, which is sort of their equivalent to Facebook, but in the early 2010s had a falling out with the Kremlin and sort of made a very quick exit from the country and has largely since then lived in exile. He then went on to found Telegram, which he's always positioned as being free from censorship and government influence and as a platform for free speech. But what that has meant is, due to its pretty lax levels of moderation, it has always been pursued by concerns that it is used for criminal activities, for sharing child abuse content, drug dealing. So then, sort of bizarrely, Durov has recently flown to France, where he has been arrested by the French authorities, held for 4 days and charged with what they describe as complicity in managing an online platform to allow illicit transactions by an organised group, for which he could get up to 10 years in prison. It's important to note that Durov, through his lawyers, has said they think it is absurd to think that the person in charge of a social network could be implicated in criminal acts that don't concern him directly or indirectly. Now, why is this important for the Ukraine conflict? Well, Telegram is hugely popular in both the Ukraine and in Russia. It is used by millions of people. It is used by both Russian dissidents and propagandists for the Kremlin. It's used by supporters of the war and those looking to bring it to an end. It's even used somewhat by the Russian military forces in a sort of semi-official capacity as a messaging service and for getting news out to the troops. And in Ukraine, it's also used for providing air raid warnings, alerts to citizens. And again, although it's discouraged, somewhat used in an informal capacity on the ground by Ukrainian forces. So what happens to this app? What happens to Durov? Whether there's any wider crackdown on the app could have a real bearing on the conflict and how it's communicated to the public in Russia and in Ukraine.
Thank you, Matt. Matt, do we know much about what the implications might be of the French authorities, getting their hands on the guy that founded it? I mean, does that mean they could have access to the systems, the algorithms underpinning it? Could you just sort of talk us through that for those of us who are not so sort of social media savvy?
I suspect that will be difficult. I think the French charges are largely going to be against Durov himself. Most of the sort of infrastructure for Telegram is largely, I imagine, held offshore, although it's possible that this could have, implications for how the network is run going forward. I think there's fundamentally a lot of unknowns about what the French are going to do now they have charged Durov and what they might try to get out of him. At this stage, it's causing a lot of concerns for people who use the app widely. I mean, for instance, the Russian military bloggers were, effectively writing that the app is now more or less compromised. I don't think we know that for sure. I mean, one thing that is worth noting is that although Telegram is sort of nominally encrypted and you can do like end-to-end encrypted messages through it if you know how and you kind of set up your settings in the right way, much of what is posted on Telegram is kind of not heavily guarded or hard to access. I mean, a lot of these Telegram channels are very public. A lot of people post openly on it like you might do on Twitter. So that's why it's been such a useful source for sort of Western intelligence and Western military analysts who, routinely use the app to monitor what the Russians are up to, where there've been attacks, what the Russian forces are sort of claiming they're going to get up to. So the sort of security element for the Russians is slightly mixed picture. In a way, having Telegram operational can be quite useful to Western intelligence in some ways. So it's unclear what the benefits of it being shut down or kind of, cracking its encryption or otherwise would be.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Matt. Just one more question from me, obviously, from zooming out slightly. It's very, very unprecedented, this, where it feels unprecedented for the head of a social network to be arrested like this. In your work as a technology reporter, where do you place this story? How surprised were you when this came through?
As you say, David, it's a massive escalation of the kinds of things that Western governments might do to crack down on social media sites. I mean, listeners in the UK will be familiar with the fact that we have a new Online Safety Act here, and that can could in theory lead to criminal charges against the leaders of social networks if they absolutely fail to tackle illegal online activity. Now, did anyone expect those powers to kind of come into force and be used by a Western government so soon? I think it's taken a lot of people by surprise. We've seen actions to shut down social networks in countries like Iran and Russia previously. Russia tried multiple times to shut down Telegram and found it very difficult to do so. But actually then, going out and arresting a founder is certainly not one that you've seen from Western governments. And where does this leave things going forward? I mean, it's going to create a lot of nervousness among social media bosses about where they travel to. Telegram is somewhat of has been described as somewhat of a rogue actor. One of the sort of overriding features of the company is it very rarely responded to like law enforcement or government requests to help deal with things like CSAM or terror content. At times it did, but generally was very reticent to get involved. So some people might think it's somewhat of an outlier, but what we've seen from social network companies lately is a kind of a drift towards looser moderation. You see this on Elon Musk's X and even to a certain extent on Facebook. They want to get involved in the sort of granular battle over free speech and the culture wars less heavily. And, the actions of the French government here are going to certainly raise questions for executives of social networks that really take an absolutely light touch approach to moderation as Telegram did.
Well, thank you so much, Matt. Is there anything we haven't spoken about that you think is important for our listeners to hear?
No, I think broadly that covers it off. I mean, I guess just in the context of Ukraine, what is really interesting here is that both sides are definitely cautious on this. I mean, so the Kremlin obviously came up very publicly and were, attacking the French for this, and they've offered assistance to Durov. He's always had a bit of a hot and cold relationship with the Russians. They basically don't like him, but at the same time, the app is super popular and he's a Russian-born citizen, so they'll kind of make a show of defending him. On the other hand, the Ukrainians also probably are going to be a bit concerned if Telegram gets shut down because it is so widely used by their citizens. So in terms of like a geopolitical story, it's a really unusual one, which is why I think it's just created so much interest.
Well, thank you so much, Matt Field, for joining us. I'm sure we'll have you on again as this story develops, but thank you so much for your time and best of luck with the rest of the day. Let's move then to our next guest. It's a great pleasure to welcome back to the podcast Adam Kinzinger, former United States representative and political commentator. Adam, can we start? I mean, we've got a lot to talk about, I think, but let's start with talking a little bit about your speech that you gave to the Democratic National Convention last Thursday in Chicago. You explained, as a life-born Republican, why you're supporting in this election Vice President Kamala Harris in November, and why you would want to persuade fellow Republicans who wish to, quote, defend democracy and decency to do the same. You even said in your speech, "I never thought I'd be here, but listen, you never thought you'd see me here, did you?" Can I ask, Adam, why did you make this speech, and what was the importance of the war in Ukraine and your views on that in your decision to do this?
Yeah, first off, it's great to be with you guys, and congrats on all the great accolades you've gotten since the last time I was on. I won't take credit for that's why you got the accolades, but you guys are doing a great job, and I rely on you guys every day, so thank you. Look, it was very easy for me to make the decision. I mean, yes, it's rare, it's weird, and as it is within any democracy, to in essence kind of turn against your party is not something that happens often, because that becomes like a political, not just a political, it becomes an identity, right? You talk to anybody in the United States, or almost anybody, and they'll tell you they're a Republican or a Democrat, and that becomes part of how you see yourself, which is actually a huge problem. But the thing that made make the decision is it's two things. Number one, I just believe the damage, personally, that has been done to our ability to self-govern by Donald Trump is incalculable. I mean, look, the basic thing you need for self-governance, whether you're a parliamentary system, a system like ours, or anything, is people have to know they can go vote. That vote is going to count. and the winner's going to win and the loser's going to lose. That's it, right? That's your basically share of democracy, if you will. And, when Donald Trump, again, my party, convinced almost every member of my party that an election was stolen, I have a hard time seeing how self-governance over time can work if a significant chunk of the country believes that their vote doesn't count. I mean, frankly, we revolted against the UK against the English because we wanted taxation with representation. And so that created a whole revolution. That's what we're based on. And then in terms of Ukraine itself, look, this is a huge issue to me. When I got into Congress in 2011 is when I was sworn in, or even 2010, one of the animating issues for me was the war in Iraq, and my belief that, we can argue whether we should have gone in or not. I think in hindsight, we know we shouldn't have. But I knew that if we'd have left Iraq early, you would have the rise of, I didn't know it would be called ISIS, but, a resurgent Al-Qaeda. And so that, it kind of animated me to run. It's like, look, we have an obligation to stay in Iraq. So foreign policy has always been an important part of this. And the idea that my party has at least half of the representatives turn their back on Ukraine is just something I can't accept. To me, this is the most important fight in the world since World War II. And so I made sure to put that in my speech as well. So I'll leave it at that. But yeah, that was really the animating reasons why I decided to speak, because history isn't going to judge if I was a good Republican. It's going to judge, in my mind, if I was a good American.
Well, thank you very much, Adam, for that. Could you talk to us a little bit then about your views on the current state of American politics in regards to Ukraine? What is your take on how the war is being talked about in this election year and in the run-up to November? Do you have confidence in either side's policies and what they've said about America's approach to Ukraine?
Yeah, I mean, look, it's obviously not the number one issue. Kind of culture war right now is a little bit of the number one issue, which is, I guess it kind of has been the last few election cycles. It underpins what's being discussed. So you may hear a discussion of the border or taxation or national debt, and all that's important, but it kind of underpins this idea of a culture war and, us against them. It's like the cities against rule. And so Ukraine isn't the number one issue that comes up. I think it's they're kind of in the background noise, though, in a very important way. The Democrats, again, it surprises me to say this, and it goes to show how political realignments happen, and they happen quickly, historically, fairly quickly. The Democrats, I think, have shown a pretty solid commitment to a victory in Ukraine. Certainly, I disagree with the idea that, they're not allowed to use American weapons in Russia to defend themselves, but the Democrats have shown a commitment. And in fact, I think one of my strongest applause lines in my speech was when I pointed out that J.D. Vance, made the comment that he doesn't care what happens in Ukraine. And, that this is a party that sees a fight in Ukraine and backs away and it retreats. So, look, I also want to be very clear, a significant amount of Republicans still support, sticking with Ukraine. The problem is the leaders of the party have either gone really silent, so we haven't heard Speaker Johnson talk about Ukraine in a while, or you have Donald Trump and J.D. Vance who have just made it clear they're going to kind of go on. They're going to go on the side of the terminally online right, that praises Putin and everything else. So, in terms of just the politics of it, I think really the future fight in Ukraine relies on, quite honestly, a Democratic victory. I think the race is as close as it's ever been. And we went from probably a almost assured loss of Joe Biden to today, it's a coin flip. I'd love to say that the polls showing Kamala 7 points up are going to stick. I think it's pretty much a tied race. And I do think America's kind of future with or without Ukraine is going to depend a lot on what happens in November.
We know that our listenership in the United States is a mix of people who support the Democrats, people who support the Republicans, but lots of them, they all listen to us. And thank you very much. I am certain we will get quite a few emails in from people who identify as Republicans who say, actually, we do support Ukraine. We are doing a lot. And they might say something like, we haven't had to leave the party to be able to do that. What would you say to people who might think like that?
Well, to an extent, I agree, which is, and I've tried to say this to people that, are still call themselves Republicans and maybe have disagreements with Donald Trump or Ukraine policy is like, okay, I get it. If you're going to stay with the party, if that is going to be maybe foreign policy, maybe Ukraine isn't your number one animating issue like it is for me. I understand that. But then fight really hard within the party. Be noisy within the party. If you're talking to a group of Republicans, stand up for Ukraine. The Republican Party needs that. Because look, I'm still conservative, and as a conservative, I believe there has to be a conservative party. It's not the Republican Party right now. I hope it becomes the Republican Party again. Otherwise, we'll have to create something new. But that's what I would say is keep fighting within the party. My concern is, let's just ask ourselves rhetorically in our heart, when was the last time you heard somebody who's still in great standing with the Republican Party stand up and make an impassioned speech on behalf of Ukraine? And they still believe it, sure, but nobody wants to challenge Donald Trump. You see that every day in our political leaders. They don't want to stand up and challenge him. And, I'll say at best he's agnostic on Ukraine. I think he believes he can cut some wonderful deal. But J.D. Vance has literally said, I don't care what happens in Ukraine. To me, I can't imagine wanting to be vice president and saying, I don't care what happens in Ukraine, or Zimbabwe for that matter, or Haiti, or any country in the world. And so, look, I would say this to my fellow Republicans is, if you're going to stay in the party, great. I understand it. I understand how, it took me years to kind of be able to break away from, to challenge so openly. But then I would encourage you to continue to please fight for the idea of Ukraine within the GOP, because it certainly needs that.
Just one more question from me, Adam, before I hand over to Dom. Again, the same sort of question, really. Obviously, Europeans and Ukraine, including Ukrainians, will be looking at the election in November as it approaches with a large amount of trepidation. As you said, it's kind of on a coin toss what may happen. What would you say to America's allies and friends in the European continent worried about what might happen in November?
Well, I used to be able to say, when I take all these meetings and for 12 years as a congressman, I'm like, don't worry, there's all this like internal stuff that goes on here that you see about because everybody pays attention to American politics. But in the end, we always do the right thing. I still generally believe that. I do worry. Honestly, I do worry. What if Donald Trump wins? I think if he does win, and so this is what I would say to my Ukrainian friends and everybody in Europe, if Donald Trump does win, don't just throw in the towel. There is a chance that we can appeal to his desire to cut a deal where at least we can, continue some sort of friendship with Ukraine, or to an extent shame him into who Vladimir Putin is and his closeness with him. But yeah, there's no doubt it's going to be a delineating point in November about what is American foreign policy in Ukraine. What I continue to say to my European friends, particularly the Germans right now, because I'm German ethnically. My family came to the United States in 1850, something from Germany. And so I'm like, come on, guys, let's get this right, which is when you keep getting, and you guys have covered this extensively, this indication that Germany is, putting out press releases that they're cutting off all aid to Ukraine, or now they're increasing it, or now they're going to have the Taurus missile, or now they're not. Look, Europe and the UK has done a fantastic job of this, despite even having a massive governing change. Europe's got to show that they're willing to do as much or more than the United States. As hawkish as I am, as much as I believe the United States is the leader of the free world, and I'll defend that to the end of the day, we really do need Europe to continue to step up. On the good side, they really have, but these mixed messages can sometimes be read, just like anything that happens in the United States can be read in Europe a certain way. When we hear Germany say, oh, we're cutting off aid next year, no, we're not. Yes, we are. No, we're not. That's kind of read as, look, Europe's not even committed to Ukraine, which of course we know Europe is committed to Ukraine. So that's what I would say is keep your message together. If the United States does somehow end up leaving Ukraine, stick with Ukraine, please, because somebody has to. But, watching our ability to stand together in our industrial capacity spinning up, as you guys have covered significantly, is a good thing. And quite honestly, I'm not hopeless about Ukraine, even if Trump wins. And I also think there's a pretty solid chance he doesn't win in November.
Adam, hi, it's Dom here. Thanks so much for joining us today. It's great to chat to you again. If I could go back to your speech at the DNC, you said, a couple of things leapt out at me. You said, I'm proud to be with you. I'm proud to be in the trenches with you as part of this sometimes awkward alliance to defend truth, democracy and decency. Democracy knows no party. Now, I was delighted to see an Air Force bloke actually make a reference to a trench and know what it is. It's not a coat. But, what is an awkward alliance in a two-party system? And I must hold my hand up here. I've made it through season 1 of Designated Survivor, but I don't think an independent's going to get a look in here. So what's an awkward alliance if it's not just Republicans either voting for the Democrat Party or not voting?
Yeah, that's a great question. And, I often look down at trenches when I'm flying over them, and I'm just sad that you guys sometimes have to just heat up day-old coffee. I can't imagine that. And also how you fly a helicopter. I will honestly say that's the thing that scares me the most is hopping in a helicopter and flying that. I love fixed wing. But okay, enough of the.
Well, it's not for everybody.
That's right. Enough of the banter. Look, the awkward alliance to me is it's very simple. So you guys actually covered this maybe 6 months, a year ago, something about these alliances that arose or didn't arise in Europe in the lead up to World War II. There were countries that pushed back against fascism, where you saw, in essence, the right, some elements of the right pair with the center and the left to defeat their fascist elements. And of course, that didn't happen in places like Germany. So I kind of see that, I'm not going to say it's against fascism in the United States, but this awkward alliance is people like me who, look, if I had my druthers, I would reelect Ronald Reagan tomorrow or Margaret Thatcher, right? Like I would bring back the old Cold Warriors. And, I'm still a center-right Republican. I'm a fairly moderate Republican. But I also recognize when my party can do damage. And to me, the most important thing is that we defend self-governance. My grandfather fought in World War II on the side of the Americans, I'll specify. And but he did that to, defend democracy. He fought with your country because, did America and the UK agree on everything? Nope. But we recognized that we had to put our differences aside and put our lives on the line to defeat this common enemy, and that there was more that united us than divided us. It's really the same here politically. I take somebody on the left. Yes, we have disagreements on policy, but we're proud Americans. And that's why I mentioned that in my speech. I said the Democrats are as patriotic as we are, because we sometimes talk each other down and they hate America or they don't. And so it's putting aside, yes, we're going to have differences in tax policy. Guess what? We've had differences in tax policy for 100 years. We're going to have it for the next 100 years. We're going to have differences on, whatever hot button issue that is. But in the near term, so let's use another army analogy. I'm sitting in a trench in Ukraine. 20 meters off is one enemy. 5 meters off is another enemy. Who's all my focus going to be on? It's going to be on the 5-meter target. Once we can save ourselves from that 5-meter target, we can go back to focusing further out. And the 5-meter target to me is just this real threat to democracy. I mean, again, if you convince a third to half of the country that the election process doesn't even work, I don't know how a democracy survives that more than a few elections, because people are going to feel unrepresented. And so this awkward alliance is, yes, we disagree on policy. We've been trained that we have to hate each other because we disagree on policy, but actually let's all like each other. Let's get along and let's focus on that threat so that we can go back to disagreeing on things. So that's what I meant by it. And quite honestly, Dom, I wish you could have been walking around with me at the Democratic convention, because I don't say this to be funny or sound arrogant. You feel like a rock star there because everybody wants to come up and shake your hand. And it's not because I'm, anybody special. It's because they recognize that, yes, we are allied together in this unique moment in time to save our country, quite honestly.
Well, thank you. You say you're a centre-right Republican. Do you think there are enough Republicans that share your concerns and would support efforts by the likes of Liz Cheney, for example, and yourself to shape a different Republican Party by 2028?
Look, I think it depends on what happens in 2024. So there is some real power in victory or defeat. And so I think if Donald Trump loses in November, there is going to be some soul searching. Look, I wish we had more time, because I would go into basically the days and weeks after January 6th. Obviously, I was there. I was in the room with all my other Republican members of Congress. And I mean, it was pretty much believed deeply that we were getting ready to flush Donald Trump down the proverbial toilet of history because of what happened on January 6th. And it was when Kevin McCarthy went to Mar-a-Lago that all of a sudden it was like this shocking awakening that, Donald Trump is here to stay. And so if there is a loss in November, I think it's hard for Donald Trump to make a comeback. The question is, does the party generally say, okay, look, we've lost every election cycle for the last 6 years, basically. It's time to figure out how to win more people instead of just, being angrier and angrier. Or does, J.D. Vance or Vivek Ramaswamy take the Trump method and basically implement it? I tend to believe there's going to be a slow awakening in the party if Donald Trump wins. There will be an open warfare, as there kind of has been in the party, for the sane right versus the kind of far right. And so the question is, it depends. I think today, if Donald Trump was out of the picture and you put like the me and Liz Cheney faction up against the kind of angry Republican faction, probably 25% would come with us, maybe 30, 70% would go with the angry faction. But I think that's a tenuous hold. So look, I'll say this, Dom, if the party continues in this angry direction, I think more than another election cycle, I do think there is a possibility. It's really hard in this country, but it's doable because what is it? The Bible says, if nobody worships God, the rocks will cry out. And that's the situation in politics. If you feel unrepresented for long enough, you're going to take that into your own hands. And there will be a new party that pops up that is conservative that will challenge the right. That's my belief, but, I've been wrong before.
We all have, and we'll be again. But so if that was a model that doesn't really sit well today, let me lob another one at you. So the best president the US never had, Jed Bartlett. It took me 4 episodes to get used to the West Wing dialogue. It was just so fast. But they managed to, in the writing there, they managed to get us over there. It wasn't jumping the shark. They managed to get us over this conceit that there was a Democrat president with a Republican vice president. They played the tensions out brilliantly. What do you think it would take for a Republican to serve as a vice president to a Democrat president?
Look, I love the theory of it. And it would probably take the Lord Jesus and, I'll let everybody to come down united and demand that this happen. Because I think, and here's the problem with it. Because, again, I as the writing suggests, as you mentioned, it would be amazing and it would feel like a very healing thing. But then you always have the question, okay, let's say you have a Democratic president and then you have a vice president and then it was a Republican. Like all of a sudden, the Democrats would be feeding that Democratic president as many vitamins and vitamin IVs and NAD infusions as physically possible to make sure that the vice president never becomes president. I think in a really divided time, it's possible. I actually think there was a chance something like that could have happened this time. But again, I think at this moment, we are just so we've been programmed. We're plugged into the matrix. Let's use some media references. We're plugged in the matrix to believe that there's only 2 sides to every issue, and they are all the most important issues ever. And, like abortion, there's only pro-life and pro-choice. There's not like 100 positions on abortion, which actually there are about 100 positions on abortion. So, yeah, I think it'd be tough, but I would love if it actually could happen. I do think it would be healing. It's just no side would actually want the other side to ever take power.
And if the call were to come, I've watched enough telly to know that people keep saying I serve at the I serve at the request of the president or something. If it were to come, would you reluctantly allow your name to go forward?
I don't think it would be too reluctant, but yeah, I would. I mean, look, I love being out of politics. The only thing I miss about Congress, and this is God's honest truth, the only thing I miss, not the 4 fundraisers a day, not the long nights, the only thing I miss is being able to be there right now for Ukraine. But I do miss politics in general, and I miss serving, just not necessarily in the House. I did my time there. So yeah, if that call came in, I would look in the mirror and say some positive words to myself and put on my tri-cornered hat and walk out and serve this country once again.
Brilliant. A straight answer from a politician. That's remarkable. Just finally for me, polls aside, Which campaign do you think has a stronger digital and field organisation to get the vote out in the battleground states for this election?
Oh, there's no doubt it's the Harris campaign. I just saw actually yesterday or something on somewhere, probably X, I'm sure. The Trump campaign has spent something like $21 million on digital. Harris has already spent close to $120 million. She's raised $500 or $600 million since it was announced she was the candidate. This is like a month or 5 weeks. It feels like a year ago, but it's not that long. You know, money obviously is very important. Unfortunately, in our politics, it's a huge problem. But I also believe that money is only effective up to a certain point. I mean, if you're going to spend $500 million in a month versus $1 billion in a month, I mean, at some point you go from what every ad on television is for Harris versus every third ad is for Colgate, you know? And it's like, okay, you're getting the message. People have their minds made up. But the field operation, which you mentioned, is really important because that is, for those that are unfamiliar with kind of how we do it here, and I think you guys are pretty good at field operations, that's making sure you're identifying who's likely to vote for you and then on election day or prior for early voting, ensuring that they get to the polls. Because there's a lot of people that forget it's election day, they don't care, or they're sick on election day. You think, how many people are sick on any given day? So that's why you try to get them to early vote. And Kamala Harris has a massive advantage there. She's got, I don't remember the latest numbers, but it's in the hundreds of paid field staff in a state like Georgia, for instance, which is kind of their second tier target. So she has the advantage here. Donald Trump, though, has shown, a real ability to sometimes go past or to sometimes violate what we would call like typical campaign rules to winning and still somehow win anyway. But there's no doubt the Harris campaign has a massive, massive advantage on that front.
Coming up, we hear Dom, Matt, and Adam's final thoughts. Well, thank you so much, Adam, for your time. Thank you, Dom, for your questions. Let's move to our final thoughts. Adam, as our guest, will come to you last, so we'll let you just collect your thoughts for a minute. But Dom, can I come to you first? Would you like to share your final thoughts today?
Yeah, thanks, David. I'm interested in news about this meeting between Jake Sullivan, US National Security Advisor, and President Xi Jinping of China. I don't think we will hear anything along these lines in any press conference. If there is such a thing, or any comments to the White House staff and press team afterwards. But I'd be very interested in the view here, very interested in Adam's view. But I wonder what President Biden and Kamala Harris and Donald Trump, how they would react if the Chinese said to what Jake Sullivan has undoubtedly said to them, as in, please stop supporting Russia. If the Chinese said, sure, we'll respect international borders, we'll stop supporting Russia's war as long as you stay out of our domestic squabble with Taiwan. I wonder how the reaction would be there, because I just can't see the US right now, as big as the stakes are. I don't think Euro-Atlantic security, Ukraine, is more important than Indo-Pacific, Taiwan to US right now. But I'd be fascinating to be a fly on the wall of that conversation.
Well, Adam, we'll certainly get your thoughts on that in a second, but let's go to Matt Field first for your final thought. Matt.
Thanks, David. Just wanted to come back to something you asked earlier. You were asking sort of how big a moment was this arrest of Pavel Durov in the kind of wider online space. One thing that was reported today was Donald Trump's got a book out next week, and in it he was threatening the arrest or life in prison of Mark Zuckerberg if Facebook was found to have interfered in any way in the upcoming presidential election. Perhaps these are empty threats, but you sort of look at the way the world is moving on online regulation. Perhaps this arrest of Pavel Durov has moved the Overton window there somewhat on what might be possible in future.
Well, thank you very much, Dom and Matt. Adam, as our guest, would you like the very final thoughts?
Yeah, thanks. And again, it's awesome to be with you guys. And I really, just from the bottom of my heart, want to say thanks for keeping this up, because it really helps me and so many people, as you all know. Look, to answer Dom's question, I think the United States would be very consistent to say, look, we believe in the ability of folks to self-determine, to determine your own future. Ukraine has made it very clear they don't want to live under the thumb of Russia, Taiwan. Even though we have this kind of awkward one China policy, Taiwan has made it clear that they don't want Chinese mainland troops in their country, and we will continue to stand with Taiwan. It's a very potent issue here. Because, it's to us, it kind of represents, Taiwan represents America's strategic commitment in Asia, which is a very important region for us. So I would love as well to be a fly on the wall, because that's a difficult subject to navigate. But I think that's where the United States says, look, we're still pretty darn powerful, and this is what we say is going to happen, and we're going to enforce that. For my final thoughts, look, it's unfortunately two things. So first, I'm very interested in continuing to see how the pressure on the weapons use inside of Russia goes, particularly as we saw this massive missile barrage yesterday, and everything else, and pressure on some of these other countries to come in and potentially create a de facto no-fly zone over Ukraine. I don't think that'll happen anytime soon, but that's something I think Ukraine ought to keep pushing. And then lastly is mobilization. Just speaking quite frankly, I've been disappointed with how tough it is for Ukraine to press mobilization. I recently found out a number about what percent of Ukrainian society is actually under arms, and it's significantly less than the U.S. had, for instance, during the draft in World War II. Ukraine's got to get its draft in order, its mobilization in order. And unfortunately, that means drafting younger, because they can only draft, I think right now it's 25 years old. I mean, in the United States, you're almost ineligible for the draft. After 25, it's like 18 to 26 or 27. So that's what I'm going to continue to watch, is to see if the Ukrainians can get their mobilization stuff straight, because I think that is the only thing really holding them back right now. And that's it for me. Over and out.
Ukraine the Latest is an original podcast from The Telegraph. To stay on top of all of our Ukraine news, analysis, and dispatches from the ground, subscribe to The Telegraph. You can get your first 3 months for just £1 at www.telegraph.co.uk/Ukraine the Latest. Or sign up to Dispatches, our Ukraine newsletter, which brings stories from our award-winning foreign correspondents straight to your inbox. We also have a Ukraine live blog on our website, where you can follow updates as they come in throughout the day, including insights from regular contributors to this podcast. You can listen to this conversation live at 1 p.m. each weekday on Twitter Spaces. Follow The Telegraph on Twitter so you don't miss it. To our listeners on YouTube, please note that due to issues beyond our control, there is sometimes a delay between broadcast and upload. So if you want to hear Ukraine the Latest as soon as it is released, do refer to podcast apps. If you enjoyed this podcast, please consider following Ukraine the Latest on your preferred podcast app. And if you have a moment, leave a review, as it helps others find the show. You can also get in touch directly to ask questions or give comments by emailing ukrainepod@telegraph.co.uk. We do read every message. And you can contact us directly on Twitter. You can find our Twitter handles in the description for this episode. Ukraine the Latest is produced by Louisa Wells and Giles Gear.